My name is Lauren. I'm the librarian and archivist at the Polish Heritage Center, and I am honored to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Dr. John Radziłowski. He received his PhD in history from Arizona State University. He was a professor of history at the University of Alaska Southeast from 2007 to 2023. He is the director of the Polish Institute of Culture and Research at Orchard Lake in Michigan. He is the author or co-author of 17 books and numerous articles on U.S. and Polish history with an emphasis on Polish immigration to the USA. I'd like to welcome Dr. John Radziłowski.
Thank you. Thank you. And to all of you, to Lauren, Angelica, Al, and thank you to the Heritage Center for inviting me to give this presentation, and very pleased to do so. I know we had last month you had Dr. Majewski on talking about literature, and this is hopefully be a nice complement to that. And when I was approached, I was, I thought about, well, what topic, could I do? And I thought about this one because it does link, Orchard Lake and our founder, Józef Dąbrowski, with Father Moczygemba, who obviously was the founder and initiator of the Polish settlement there at Panna Maria, as well as many others. And the two men did share a connection. They worked very closely together at certain points to really to lay the foundation for Polish American education. And so I thought that would be a kind of appropriate topic. And it's one that is not particularly well known. And I have a few slides here, so I'll try to share that. Hopefully everyone can see that. And it's a topic that is not particularly well known. There are some 9 million Americans today who have family origins in Poland, and Polish Americans are one of the biggest groups of Americans with roots in East Central Europe. Yet the history of Polish Americans is scarcely known in the U.S., even among descendants of Polish immigrants, and if anything, it's even less well understood in Poland. The reasons for this are many and varied, but the decline of a specifically Polish American education system and the class of people who created and sustained it is one of the major factors in this amnesia. The idea that there was a Polish American education system may come as a surprise to some, but this is perhaps a good indicator of how much of this history has been lost to our collective memory. At its height in the mid-20th century, Polish Americans had created and sustained a system of over 600 Polish Catholic parochial schools, 90 high schools, 31 junior colleges training professed religious, 4 nursing schools, 8 teacher training colleges, 5 minor and 5 major seminaries, and 2 four-year colleges. And this doesn't include any less formal programs for adult learning or literacy that were offered in a lot of Polish communities. In addition, there was an active cottage industry writing and publishing textbooks for Polish American schools, as well as periodicals for teachers and a well-developed curriculum. Polish immigrants were certainly not the only ethnic group to establish an impressive educational system, but Polish American education stands out for its comprehensiveness and its fusion of religious faith, bilingualism, and dual patriotism. The system was almost entirely Catholic. There were some community schools, and later on, as we get in the post-World War II period in particular, there's quite a number of Saturday schools that are developed, and those are still quite active today. But there were community schools, but a lot of those are based out of parishes. Not all of them, but quite a few are. But there were some community schools emphasizing adult education that were formed outside of parishes. A number of examples in Chicago and Philadelphia and a number of other places. The Polish National Catholic Church did form some parish schools and ran its own seminary. But the children of PNCC families mostly seem to have attended public schools. Now, Polish American education was the subject of several scholarly books and articles beginning in the 40s and continuing to the early 1980s. These works chronicle certain aspects of Polish American education, and a lot of them are available online or through different academic libraries. But they generally assess Polish American education in a negative way, with a particular reference to the period of the 1890s, when the system was still kind of in its infancy. It's also noteworthy that many of the sharpest critiques were Polish intellectuals from Galicia who compared Polish schools with the Polish schools in Galicia that served a relatively well-off urban population, but were almost non-existent in rural areas where most of the population resided. So it was kind of I would say, to put it kindly, an apples and oranges comparison. We shouldn't underestimate the problems facing the first generation of Polish American educators, however. Polish immigrants arrived from a land in which basic education was either denied or severely restricted. In the German and Russian partition, Polish education faced varying degrees of restriction from state authorities. In Austria and Galicia, where Polish education faced the fewest restrictions, poverty and lack of access resulted in a similar situation. Educational opportunities were best among families of the gentry or intelligentsia or the urban middle or lower middle classes, but worst among the peasants, who were really the bulk of Polish immigrants to the United States. And that's especially true in remote areas. Parish schools, often taught by the church organist, offered little beyond basic catechism. In America, Polish immigrants could take advantage of local public schools, but these did nothing to impart Polish language or culture or instill the Catholic faith, all of which were deemed important by the immigrants themselves. After creating a Polish parish, newly formed immigrant communities almost always sought to found a school as well. Another obstacle was that immigrants often spoke non-standard Polish or even a distinct regional dialects from regions like Silesia, Podhale, or Kashubia. Early teachers had to teach a standard form of Polish to immigrants who might know any number of forms of Polish, or children who'd spent several years in a partly English-speaking environment without any schooling at all. Proper textbooks were nearly impossible to find, even when they could be imported from Europe. Lack of teachers is an even bigger problem. The first Polish schools in America tried to follow the standard of Polish village schools by hiring an organist who could double as a teacher. This proved highly unsatisfactory, since many of those hired were incompetent, others were paid so little they never stayed for more than a few months. Even without those obstacles, a single teacher was overwhelmed by the sheer number of students that flooded into parish schools and communities that were made up largely of young families with many children. And it's really important to remember that in the 20th century, Polish communities were extremely young, where, as true, I think, of a lot of newer immigrant communities. Italians kind of the same way, where really half or more of the population in any given community was going to be under the age of 16. So just a huge number of young people, because all the immigrants that were coming were of basically marriageable age, and they were getting married and having kids, or had been recently married and were bringing families. So to better evaluate the history of Polish American education, it's probably time for a re-examination of Polish American education on its own terms. And one place to begin is to look at individuals who helped found the system. A phenomenon as diffuse and large as Polish American education. Slide here, and here's a picture of the from the St. Joseph School that I found, and I would say kind of representing that early generation, the first part of the 20th century. So one place to look is the individuals who found the system. Now, and that's why I picked our two individuals today. And of course, a system as large and diffuse as this is not founded by at a single point in time by a single person. However, the two most important influential figures in the early development of Polish American education were Father Leopold Moczygemba and Father Józef Dąbrowski. Now, Father Moczygemba was born in Silesia near Opole in 1824. He was educated in German schools, and at the age of 19 discerned a call to religious life, traveled to Italy, and entered the Franciscan order, the order of Friars Minor Conventual. He spent 5 years in Italy, where when he was ordained, he was sent to Würzburg in Germany. While he was there, he met the new Bishop of Galveston, Texas, Jean-Marie Audin, who recruited Father Moczygemba along with some other Franciscans to come and serve his very large missionary diocese. From 1852 to 1854, he served German parishes in the Galveston diocese and served as the superior of all the Franciscan conventual missions in Texas. During this time, he wrote letters to family and friends back home in Silesia, encouraging them to come to Texas to settle. He even selected a plot of land. A group of around 200 Silesian Poles set out for America on the strength of his letters, settling at the site of Panna Maria, Texas, creating the first viable Polish community in North America. After a period of drought and hardship, Father Moczygemba was forced to leave Panna Maria in 1857, when the Poles he had encouraged to come blamed him for their misfortunes. He thereafter served German in some Polish parishes in New York State and throughout the Midwest. He served as a commissary general for all conventual Franciscan missions in the United States. He returned to Rome in 1868, where he served in the important post of confessor for pilgrims visiting St. Peter's, and wrote a handbook for missionary priests going to America. He returned to America in 1871, served several parishes, and helped to found the Polish Roman Catholic Union of America in 1873. In 1879, he left the Franciscans and joined the Congregation of the Resurrection. Several years later, he became a secularized diocesan priest and passed away in Dearborn, Michigan, near where we are here in 1891. Now, before I turn, and sort of a brief sketch of the biography of Father Moczygemba, before we turn to talk about his role and also our second individual, I want to discuss, and especially Moczygemba's role in founding our institution here at Orchard Lake. I want to highlight a couple of key items in Father Moczygemba's biography to better understand his role in this story. And the first is career progress within the conventual Franciscan order and the progressively greater responsibility he assumed, at least until his health began to suffer. And he did have a falling out with some folks in the conventual Franciscans, which we can, people have questions about that. I have some thoughts on why that was. But his health seems to have been an issue, by the way, even when he was younger, after his ordination. And the second is the timing of his travels. He assumed an important post in Rome in 1868 through 70. And this coincided with the First Vatican Council, an overlooked but critically important event in the history of the Church. It's also just 2 years after the founding of the Polish College in Rome. And significantly, after Father Moczygemba entered religious life, he did not spend much time at all in Poland, returning home only briefly to care for his dying mother in 1871. His curriculum vitae presents an image of a priest who is well regarded within the Church, especially in Rome, and in contact with Vatican, well, it was even before it was called the Vatican leaders, and he represented a knowledgeable and trusted source in Rome on conditions facing the Catholic Church in America, especially among immigrants. Now, he's also acquainted with two other figures, and I'll maybe come back to that slide there. He's in contact with two other figures who play important supporting roles in the development of education in Polonia. The first of these was Mieczysław Cardinal Leopold, who was a Vatican diplomat before becoming Archbishop of Poznań and Gniezno and Primate of Poland. Cardinal Leopold was sort of the 19th century counterpart to the 20th century's Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński. During the Kulturkampf in Bismarck's Germany, he defended the independence of the Church and the use of the Polish language in schools and was arrested and imprisoned for his defiance. He refused Bismarck's demands that he resign his office and was forced into exile in Rome. Cardinal Leopold was strongly supported by Pope Pius IX, who had his own conflicts with an overweening secular government, and his successor, Pope Leo XIII. He was appointed prefect for the propagation of the faith in 1892 and was without question the most important Pole in Rome. Now, the second most important Pole in Rome was arguably Father Piotr Semenenko, one of three founders of the Congregation of the Resurrection, along with Father Bogdan Jański and Father Hieronym Kajszewicz. The trio were former student revolutionaries who had fought against Russian rule of the November insurrection of 1830-31. Forced into exile in Paris, the bitter legacy of the failed revolt and Tsarist repression brought about a conversion of all three men from romantic revolutionaries with utopian visions to a deeper faith in God and the importance of education and moral development. Father Semenenko would become the first rector of the Polish College in Rome in 1866. A renowned scholar, teacher, and spiritual director, he was the spiritual and intellectual director to several future saints and bishops. Now, because Father Moczygemba was well acquainted with the recently formed Polish College in Rome and moved in the same circles as Cardinal Leopold and Father Semenenko, it's quite possible that when he was in Rome, he met a Polish seminarian who was studying there in 1868 to 69 named Józef Dąbrowski. It seems quite plausible the two men met in Rome prior to Dąbrowski's immigration to America. Rome was still a comparatively small town, and there weren't that many Poles in Rome, and they all congregated around the Polish College. So I think it's a fair assumption to say that their paths probably crossed at some point there. This would help to explain why Moczygemba would later settle quite quickly on the younger priest to carry on the huge task of founding and organizing the Polish seminary in America, for which Moczygemba would spend several years preparing. Now, Father Józef Dąbrowski is Polonia's candidate for the world's most interesting man. If you remember those commercials they used to have, those were not very good beer. The world's most interesting man. Dąbrowski is my candidate for this, for at least the world's most interesting Polish American guy. He was born to a family of gentry origin, was a talented student with an interest in science and mathematics. He attended the Warsaw Academy, which is the future University of Warsaw. He became involved in a secret student society dedicated to overthrowing Russian rule and restoring Polish independence, and he served as a bodyguard to one of the leaders of the January uprising, Ludwik Mirosławski. He cheated death in more than one desperate battle with Russian troops. After the failure of the uprising, he eluded the Okana and escaped to the west. He worked as an itinerant laborer while attempting to continue his studies, often penniless and sleeping rough or in cheap workers' hostels. At one point, another Polish immigrant robbed him of like a significant sum of money. So he was really kind of on the down and out. He discerned a call to the priesthood and went to Rome shortly after the founding of the Polish college. At his point, his life at that point had been an almost exact parallel to that of his teacher and mentor, Father Semenenko. And it's hard not to think of the head of the Polish college saw in Dąbrowski a younger version of himself. So Dąbrowski was ordained in 1869, and within a few months later was sent to minister to Polish immigrants in America in rural Wisconsin. Now, the importance of education was foremost in the thoughts of both Father Dąbrowski and Father Moczygemba, and was integral to the founders of the Polish College and the Congregation of the Resurrection. And remember that not only Dąbrowski was initially began as a member of that congregation, and Father Moczygemba would join later on. The situation in America, however, presented a seemingly impossible challenge, since there were few schools that existed were utterly inadequate. There were almost no qualified teachers, no way to train teachers, few textbooks, no curriculum. On top of it, there were not enough priests to serve the rapidly growing Polish communities, provide the kind of leadership needed to form and sustain schools at the community level. Shortly after arriving in Wisconsin, Father Dąbrowski summarized the situation in a letter to his mentor, Father Semenenko, back in Rome. The Poles, he wrote, live without mass, without confession, without sermons, without instruction. And the youth reared in such conditions, I don't know how they will ever benefit the church or society. It's impossible to open schools because there are no teachers. We cannot train priests because there's no place and no one to train them. We must save the situation while there is still time. So individually in cooperation, these two priests would set out to change this picture. Along the way, they would receive a great deal of help from many different directions toward the goal of creating a viable system of education for Polish immigrants. But the two priests played a role that was fundamental to Polish American education. The education, formation, and life experience of both propelled their interest in education. Father Dąbrowski's earliest correspondence from America is devoted to the subject. For Father Moczygemba, schools were integral to his missionary work in America. He founded the first parochial school under the patronage of St. Joseph, in Texas. It's at Pana Maria. He also founded or helped to start a novitiate in Texas to train priests and brothers for the conventual Franciscans, and later create a similar institution in New York. As pastor of the German parish of St. Mary's in Litchfield, Illinois, he founded a parish school there as well. So the roles played by these two priests, however, were distinct. Father Moczygemba proved quite successful in the church at large, especially in Rome. He was able to raise what at that time was a significant amount of money for his missionary endeavors and ultimately for the project of building a Polish seminary. Father Moczygemba's connections proved especially fortunate in 1879 when he was able to secure permission from Pope Leo XIII to start to raise funds to open a Polish seminary in America. In the background of this effort was Cardinal Leopold. And here I'd like to, I'll show you this slide. This is something we have in our collection that may interest all of you in Texas. This is a book published in Rome in 1715. It's a devotional work to Our Lady. But the really interesting part is the inscription in the inside papers, which, if you can read the script, is Father Leopold Moczygemba, and it's a memoir, a remembrance of his visit to the Apostolic Basilica of the Vatican, 1879. So that was actually during his trip that he made to visit the Pope and secure permission for the Polish seminary. So I stumbled across that going through our old book collection, and it jumped out at me. So so that I'm very happy to share that with you. So in the background of this effort was Cardinal Dąbrowski. While we might imagine Moczygemba setting out for Rome on a lonely mission to convince the Vatican to pay attention to the needs of a fledgling immigrant community, as we've seen, he was already a known quantity in Rome. He was knowledgeable about conditions among immigrants. And remember, he had written that handbook already for priests going to America. And that was something, it's a very rare book. We don't have a copy here. I think there's only a few copies remaining, but it was something that obviously, if he was able to publish that in Rome, it must have been something that authorities there were very interested in publishing. So he's very knowledgeable about conditions among immigrants in the New World. The problems facing Polish immigrants were also well known, especially to Cardinal Dąbrowski. One of the most important Pole in Rome, again, was a man with the ear of the Pope. We've already quoted one of Father Dąbrowski's letters to Father Semenenko at the Polish College. The cardinal himself had also received letters from other Polish priests in America about the lack of priests, the need for schools, and he had received similar information from some American bishops who had been concerned enough about the topic to contact Rome. It's important to recall it was during this time that Father Moczygemba was also transferring from the conventual Franciscans to the Congregation of the Resurrection, which is really the congregation that's running the Polish College at this time. And as an aside, it's worth remarking here about the relationship between Polish American Catholics and Rome, which was considerably more important in many respects in the early decades than their relationship to any bishop or diocese in Poland. When facing disputes with local ordinaries, it was Rome that Polish American clergy or communities looked to for relief, and sometimes with success. For example, during the Koleshinsky affair here in Detroit in the 1890s, while Catholic publishing houses in Poland were an important source of theological and pastoral material, due to the handicaps imposed by the partitioning powers, there was very little other practical assistance the church in partition Poland could offer. It was not until the 1930s that the first cooperative efforts between the Polish episcopate and Polonia got underway, and those were halted abruptly in the summer of 1939 and the weeks before the German invasion. It was not until the time of Primate Stefan Cardinal Wyszynski, following his own release from communist jail, that Catholic Polonia was able to develop enduring ties to the church in the homeland. The Roman formation and connections of both Father Moczygemba and Father Dąbrowski were crucial to their approach and outlook. It gave them an appreciation for the universal nature of the Catholic Church and the unified hierarchical structure that could respond to the problems of modern industrial society. And that was one of the reasons why it is so important that Father Moczygemba is in Rome at the time of the First Vatican Council, because that was, even though that was cut short, you can go back and go off in a rabbit hole and talk about that. But one of the things that flowed out of that was a renewed interest in lay devotions, and of course that's followed by Pope Leo XIII and really the flourishing of social doctrine in the Catholic Church. And those were all things that, if you start to unpack some of the background of these two men, that is obviously going to be very influential. And while never forgetting the unique needs of the problems of Poles in America, keeping Polonia firmly tied to the Church, in the view of both Dąbrowski and Moczygemba, would offer greater protection and assistance in the new environment confronting Polonia. Polish identity and Catholicism were, in this view, mutually supporting. And the effort to create the seminary to train Polish priests would be the capstone of the Polish-American educational effort. When he served as president of the Polish-Roman Catholic Union of America, the PRCUA, from 1875 to 1880, Father Moczygemba made the building of the seminary a top priority. During his tenure, and with support of the new lay organization as well, he would undertake the journey to Rome to secure papal approval. Through his fundraising efforts and with the assistance of the PRCUA and the Resurrectionists, Father Moczygemba was able to raise around $8,000 for this cause, which, you know, it's hard to compare dollars today in 1880s, but if you're going to do the inflation adjusted, I would guess that's around about $250,000 today. So that's a significant amount of money. In addition, he appears to have secured some further sums from the seminary, either from his own savings or through some real estate transactions that he conducted. Now, despite this promising start, the effort was plagued by problems. The planned location for the seminary in Nebraska was proving impractical, to say the least. A great deal of uncertainty surrounded the proposal, particularly the actual function and purpose of the proposed institution was not entirely clear. More seriously, a split within the fledgling Polish community in America had emerged with the founding of the Polish National Alliance, or the PNA, in 1880. The PNA strongly opposed clerical leadership in Polonia, particularly the Chicago resurrectionists, particularly Father Wincenty Barzinski, who was the leading resurrectionist in America at that time. On top of these challenges, Father Moczygemba's health was in decline. Even though he was comparatively young by today's standards, he felt compelled to hand the effort off to a younger colleague. The potential difficulties proposed by locating the seminary in Nebraska were overcome in the early 1880s by moving the planned institution to Detroit. Detroit was already well known to the leaders of the effort and had been the birthplace of the PRCUA. It had a rapidly growing Polish community and was centrally located. It had also avoided at that point the type of serious church disputes that were already a feature of Polish American life in Chicago. Now that, of course, was about to change very soon, as shortly after the seminary was founded, as we'll see in a moment. In addition, the effort to create the seminary was supported by the Bishop of Detroit, Caspar Borges. The PRCU's role in the founding of the seminary is actually quite complicated. That's maybe a topic for another time. But it did assess its members each $1 for the seminary, which was probably the genesis of the startup funds for Moczygemba's effort. It later appears that both Father Dąbrowski and Moczygemba had a falling out with Father Wincenty Barzinski, who was the most powerful resurrectionist in the United States at that time. Although it helped develop the idea of the seminary, it ceased financing the effort by 1885. But interestingly, a group of PRCUA societies actually broke off over the seminary issue in the Detroit area and formed their own institution that did support the seminary. And even more ironically, the PNA was sending support to the seminary, even at a time when it wasn't until after the death of both Father Dąbrowski and Father Barzinski that the PRCUA started to provide some support for the seminary. But after Father Moczygemba stepped back from leading the effort, he passed the torch to Father Dąbrowski. He would be the one more than anyone else who would give shape and content to the form of Polish American education. Father Dąbrowski was a polymath and a man of almost limitless curiosity. He had a strong academic background in math and science, which began in Warsaw, but was also fostered in Rome, where Father Semenenko encouraged seminarians to understand developments in modern science and technology. His curiosity occasionally caused him some embarrassment, just at the time a new generator was installed in the Felician Sisters Convent. He could not resist dismantling it to understand how it worked, but was unable to put it back together again and had to call for the electrician who had installed it to get it running once more. He had a facility for languages, which in addition to his native Polish included Russian, German, English, and Latin. He ministered to the local Ojibwe people in Wisconsin and learned their language well enough to create the first Polish Ojibwe dictionary, copies of which sadly are lost. He also he likely had a working knowledge of Czech and probably Lithuanian as well. After arriving in Detroit as the chaplain to the Felicians, Father Dąbrowski founded the Polish seminary in 1885, naming it after St. Cyril and Methodius. Although it was the millennium of the saint's mission to the Slavic nations, the choice of these patrons also signaled his broad ambitions to reach out to groups close in language and history to the Poles, notably Lithuanians, Czechs, Slovaks, and Ruthenians. It also symbolized the planting of the faith among immigrants from Polish lands with a similar missionary spirit. Naturally, the founding year did not go as Father Dąbrowski planned. The next door parish of St. Albertus was rocked with a conflict caused by the removal of the popular but controversial pastor, Father Dominik Koleszinski, just months after the laying of the cornerstone of the seminary. Bishop Borges then placed Father Dąbrowski in the difficult position of interim pastor. Riots by Koleszinski's supporters led to the deployment of Detroit police inside the church and the death of one protester in the months that followed. Father Dąbrowski was threatened, assaulted, and subject to all sorts of calumny, and the parish was placed under interdict by the bishop. Nevertheless, Father Dąbrowski persisted, and while managing the affairs of the parish and providing pastoral care to the part of the Polish community that did not back Koleszinski, and serving as chaplain for the Felicians and teaching at the novitiate, he proceeded to open the seminary and teach there, and do so despite the severe financial situation caused by the controversy and an overall economic downturn facing the U.S. And you're just amazed when you sort of read the list of things that he was accomplishing under these circumstances. You're really astonishing. So what sort of institution was this first Polish seminary? The founding documents and statements made by the founders and supporters of the effort throughout the 1870s and 1880s led some scholars to ask whether the original intent of the papal approval was for a college that would prepare Polish men to enter American seminaries, or for a seminary that would form priests all the way to ordination. In addition, some have even raised the question about the creation of a high school during this period and how it's related to the seminary project. The two options, seminary versus college, were not mutually exclusive. Father Dąbrowski took a holistic approach to education. And it did happen throughout the history of St. Cyril and Methodius Seminary that students began their education and formation and later transferred to diocesan seminaries. The seminary, as it was founded and developed, always allowed for that possibility. However, Father Dąbrowski created a standalone seminary, and this fact was never questioned by the powers that be, particularly by the bishops and archbishops of Detroit. And given what we know about Bishop Borges, who was the Detroit bishop at that time when the seminary was founded, and he approved the seminary and blessed its cornerstone, it's inconceivable that he would have allowed Father Dąbrowski to exceed the authorization implied by Father Moczygemba's letter and Pope Leo's approval, or to develop an institution that did not fully conform to existing canon and civil law. One problem that confronted the seminary from the outset, and this was also a problem of an issue facing the Felician Novitiate and other early Polish American institutions, was that many of the applicants were very young and did not have adequate educational preparation to enter a seminary or a college. A few years after its founding, Father Dąbrowski created a curriculum which was fully developed by 1892 and 93 to provide a better grounding for such students. This became a department within the seminary known as the Classics Department. It was a 5-year course, with the final year being viewed as equivalent to the first year at an American university. And one of the things as you're looking at some of these early institutions to keep in mind is there was no standardized, even in the United States, no standardized education that we understand today, where you have elementary school and you go to high school and you go to college. And those steps were often blended together, especially in the European gymnasium model. And so trying to distinguish between them is really kind of impossible. After that, students then advanced to what was known as the senior college to take more intensive courses in theology and philosophy, and that would then prepare them to enter the priesthood. A new remedial program was begun by 1902 to address the deficiencies of boys not even ready yet for the classics department. So one of the things that's happening is, and we'll talk about more in a minute, is you have huge numbers of young people are showing up at these institutions, really wanting an education, wanting into religious life, and some of them just don't have that preparation. They have the heart, but they don't have the knowledge or the preparation for that yet. And it's also important to note the seminary also began offering evening classes to working men who had missed out on a proper education in Poland. And this became one of its most popular and well-enrolled programs until it moved from Detroit to Orchard Lake in 1909. The model used was that of the European gymnasium, which looked quite different from our contemporary education. Father Dąbrowski created an institution that was tailored to the specific educational needs of the growing Polish community. It was also fully in keeping with contemporary education in the United States and Europe, and in accord with developments within the American Catholic Church. His correspondence in the archival material shows he kept abreast of contemporary educational research and changes, and was able to set a high standard for his students and colleagues when facing problems with innovation and flexibility. And this approach was evident in Dąbrowski's work from the beginning. He had a significant impact on the education of Polish immigrants even before he took over the seminary project. 4 years after 4 years of struggle to create a viable school in Polonia, Wisconsin, in 1874, he was able to secure the help of 6 Felician sisters, and it's the Sisters of St. Felix of Kantelice from Krakow, to teach in his school and set up a religious house in the parish. This order was already familiar to Father Dąbrowski, and their story again parallels his own. Founded in Warsaw by Blessed Angela Truszkowska in 1855, the Felicians were dedicated to serving God, the church, and the needs of the urban poor and working class. They were also fiercely patriotic. During the January uprising, they sheltered Polish insurgents, cared for sick and injured partisans, and aided their widows and orphans. And for this, they were expelled by Russian authorities and forced to relocate in Krakow. Securing the Felicians for Polonia was one of Father Dąbrowski's most important achievements. In time, they would come to staff over a third of Polish parochial schools and were the first Polish women's religious community to establish a presence in the USA. They were followed in 1885, by the way, by the Sisters of the Holy Family of Nazareth, an order founded by Blessed Maria Franciszka Sedlicka in 1874. Anyone want to guess where she founded that order of the Sisters of the Holy Family of Nazareth? Well, it was Rome. And so really, in a way, as we're looking at this story, all roads are leading back to Rome still at this point. Although nuns teaching in Catholic schools were already common in America, none of the existing religious orders were equipped to take on Polish parochial schools. Very few Polish women joined non-Polish orders in the U.S., and while German-American religious orders did have some Polish-speaking members, they were too few and often assigned elsewhere. German orders were also viewed with disfavor, and there was little love lost between Germans and Poles in America, especially after the Kulturkampf in Germany. The arrival of Polish religious orders would prove the solution to the teacher shortage, but only gradually, since the number of teachers was still too few to fill the need. The early history of the Felicians in America chronicles the struggles the order faced in the light of demands from Polish communities across the country for teachers. Parishes that requested teachers from this new American establishment in the early years were rarely denied outright, but this meant that sisters were often spread very thin, and in many cases, new postulants were assigned to schools without adequate training or religious formation, an on-the-job training regime that no doubt fueled some of the criticism of Polish intellectuals. However, a very remarkable thing was already happening. The Felicians and other orders of Polish women religious were flooded with new aspirants. Within the first weeks of arrival in rural Wisconsin, the Felicians were receiving young women who wanted to join their ranks. Many of these new recruits were very young, in some cases even 13 or 14 years old. So there was a real hunger to join for vocations, and it was a vocations crisis of a different sort, if you will. The spiritual father of the Felicians in America, Father Dąbrowski, took a special interest in the problems of training sisters to become teachers. Although he's rightly remembered for his role in the founding of the Polish seminary, it's often forgotten that after his arrival in Detroit in 1882, he helped start his first institution of higher learning, a seminary for the Felicians that would form Polish American sisters and teach them to train in Polish schools. Father Dąbrowski was a hands-on leader, and he taught many of the new classes of the new Felician seminary, especially in the fields of theology, science, math, and geography. A Felician historian noted that Father Dąbrowski was the heart and soul of the new school. One account reads, "Botany classes were not taught without field trips to the convent gardens, where every leaf, every tree and its leaves, flowers, and fruit were classified. Father Dąbrowski presumed that a girl couldn't really know a pear tree until she tasted a ripe pear from the tree. During those weeks where he taught astronomy, he would take students into the garden on clear nights where he would point out the constellations and changes in the sky. In the classroom, he used a handmade globe to illustrate facts during his astronomy lectures. Other teaching models which the sisters recalled were large-sized wooden cubes, spheres, and triangles for geometry, and the collection and demonstration of objects for his explanation of the steam locomotive or the magnetic attraction of physics. In addition to science, he taught drawing. He gave lessons in photography, even in song and dance and cooking. To serve Polonia, he wanted well-rounded men and women who were serious, Catholic, and focused, but also understood the world and its beauty and could apply themselves to practical problems, whether caring for a sick child or rewiring a home. And if all that wasn't enough, Father Dąbrowski was also in the business of creating textbooks. This is Dąbrowski and his first church in Polonia. This church was built a little bit after he left. And this is the St. Albertus, where the first a seminary was founded, and we'll come back to that in a second. But these are actually also two items from our collection, and these are two textbooks that Father Dąbrowski himself wrote. The first one, and this is was published. The one on the left-hand side is published in Polonia, Wisconsin, before he went to Detroit. And this is actually the original printing was a couple years earlier than this. This is a second edition. This is a reader for Polish schools, so it's basically meant to taught very basic. These are very small little books. And the other was a geography that was done as kind of a question and answer for students. So very basic, but again, even at this early stage, he's thinking about what sort of education young people should be having. And so after there were a couple early catechisms that were created before this, and were published by other priests in the 1870s. He undertook this effort to provide instructional materials were not just adaptations of things that were done in Europe, but were tailored to the needs of Polonia's children. By the beginning of the 20th century, textbook writing and publishing was firmly in the hands of Polish American women religious, with Felician sisters taking the major role. And there's a group of Felicians in their convent, in the original convent in Detroit. No other American ethnic group had such an extensive textbook publishing approach, which was so specific to the American context. And we compare this with German Americans, because they had much more access to materials from Germany, they were much more likely to use or adapt German textbooks rather than create their own here in America. And so, as you look at German American histories of German American within the Catholic context, textbooks, they begin, very, very much like they would have in a German school in Germany, and then gradually over the course of several decades, as new editions are published, they're adding more material about the United States, but it's an add-on. It's sort of add-on to that original textbook rather than starting from scratch and writing the textbook from start. He also created the first integrated curriculum for Polish American schools, and this process was already well underway while he was in Wisconsin, but pursued with greater intensity after the move to Michigan. In an early letter to Mother Angela in Krakow, he explained, "My reply to your question about the exact kind of schools we plan, dear Mother, is they will be elementary schools in which the subjects to be taught will include catechism, arithmetic, geography, sacred scripture, history, and perhaps also find handiwork for the girls. We must, however, be on a par with the public schools, maintaining a high level since the Protestants strive for a thorough education." As the seminary developed, Father Dąbrowski elaborated that the purpose of the Polish seminary is the education of Polish youth in the religious, moral, and national spirit, and at the same time, by means of classical training, modern language, and natural sciences, to prepare youth for future professions, namely sacred theology taught at the institution, or lay professions, law, medicine, technical studies, and the like. So the seminary, even though it was really formed to train priests, also had this dual mission to train people who would go out and be leaders of the secular community. Now, aside from the seminary, Father Dąbrowski handed off the development of the curriculum for parochial schools to the Felicians and to other religious sisters. They would ultimately implement most of his ideas in which they put their own stamp. The curriculum emphasized bilingual education by teaching certain subjects such as religion or Polish history in Polish, while teaching others American history or science and math in English. Parochial schools became the guardians and incubators of the Polish language in the USA. This proved durable as the system expanded during the 1920s, and teacher education programs in religious communities grew and improved. Textbook publishing became a major endeavor, with publishers in Chicago, Detroit, and Buffalo producing tens of thousands of books for Polish schools. Most of the textbooks were written in the USA. Although the restoration of Polish independence in 1918 made it possible to import Polish books in larger quantities, the overwhelming number of Polish textbooks were still entirely an American effort. Book importation from Poland seems to have been largely to supplement school libraries. Even as late as the 1950s, new textbooks for teaching Polish were being written and published by the intrepid nuns. The Polish-American educational system was hit hard by the Depression and the Second World War, but rebounded in the late 1940s and early 50s due to the baby boom and the arrival of Polish refugees from Europe. The teaching of Polish was the first casualty of changing times, as parents in the 1950s pressured schools to drop the language as the price of admission to mainstream middle-class American society, which for the first time seemed to be within reach of Polish-American families. The nuns teaching in the schools, with the support of many Polish-American newspapers, fought a rearguard action to keep bilingual education. But Polish was increasingly taught only as a foreign language and then mainly in high schools. A second major blow was the aftermath of Vatican II in the USA, which resulted in the collapse of vocations to the religious orders that have been so important to the educational system envisioned by Father Dąbrowski, Father Moczygemba, and others. It was also marked by an American church that saw less need for parochial schools in general and an overall desire to end distinctively ethnic parishes and their attachments to devotional, liturgical, and paraliturgical practices that were then viewed as outdated. And ironically, these old country devotional ways were much more products of the after effects of Vatican I and the American milieu rather than attachments to customs brought over from Europe. that's a story for another day. But it's important to remember that despite some losses, some of the educational institutions founded by Polish Americans continue to function well, even if they no longer serve exclusively Polish students. And incidentally, when Dąbrowski founded the seminary, he had a very large contingent of Lithuanian students here. There was an entire department of Lithuanian here, and they were actually planning to do a department of Czech as well in the seminary before he passed away. So he had never envisioned the institutions to be exclusively purely Polish, but to serve those other related groups. Father Dąbrowski and Father Moczygemba gave birth to a remarkable phenomenon. From nothing other than ideas and prayers, they pioneered the creation of a vast array of schools across the United States that educated hundreds of thousands of people, sustained the Polish faith and culture in America for generations. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. I can show you a few more of these. Yeah, this is by the way an example, and this was published in a paper in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It was a Felician. It actually occupied 2 full pages of 2 successive issues in the Grand Rapids Courier in 1905. So basically it was to inform all the parents of what the curriculum was going to look like, and provide that education to parents.
Thank you so much, Dr. Radziłowski. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Oh, I hear someone.
Well, now scientists in the UK are taking a page from the 6th nuclear power plant owner.
I think that's probably a background.
Oh,
The segregating what's fish.
let me look through.
Yeah, this is the seminary. Someone beforehand was asking me our seminary is now closed. It closed 2 years ago, but the high school continues here. There was also a college here as well, but our institute continues. So the cultural mission, if you will, of the Orchard Lake schools.
Yes, Bojan, I see your hand.
Hello, everyone, and happy Easter season to everyone, and and any other holidays you may celebrate. This is so interesting. I am really enthralled with it. I wanted to ask you, well, just for now, whether one of the 2 colleges that you mentioned were started, was one of them Alliance College?
Yes, that was in Cambridge Springs, and the 2 there was obviously the seminary, and then there was a St. Mary's College that was formed as part of the seminary. Those were the 2 4-year colleges, and actually some of the faculty actually taught in both, or they moved from one to the other. So the Alliance College was formed by the Polish National Alliance, hence its name, and became famous during World War I as the place where the Falcons held training course. The Polish Falcons held training courses for officers that would later form the so-called Blue Army of General Haller in World War I. And it continued. I can't remember which date it closed. I want to say the late 80s. But it was a very viable institution, sort of small 4-year liberal arts college. Yes.
Mark.
Were they involved in helping the Felicians open provinces in the East Coast as well? I'm interested because I'm the product of Felician Sisters education in South Amboy, New Jersey. Now a closed school, but I was curious.
The demand. Thanks, Mark, and greetings to everyone in Minnesota there. So what happened is that the original province was first it started obviously in Wisconsin, then moved to Detroit, but very quickly they began to because of first of the demand, and second of all the number of new sisters that were entering the order, that they quickly began to add new provinces, and so they added Chicago, they added Buffalo, they had one in New Jersey as well, actually Coraopolis, Pennsylvania. I think that one also covered New Jersey, Those have since mostly consolidated back into what is now the Livonia, Michigan province. But they were serving communities in as far away as Oklahoma. They did have a mission in during the Second World War in refugee camps in Mexico. So very, very widely spread.
Do you have any data on how many Polish women, were,
I don't right offhand, but there's actually I can if you want to email me later,
Sure.
I can give you a number of references. There's quite a good histories of the Felicians, including ones I have to admit written by my own dad, who was also a professor for a number of years. And studied this topic. I have a number. I myself have 3 of my great aunts were Felician sisters, so I have a special. And we have a relationship with Madonna University, which is just south of here, which is the college. It's continuing 4-year college founded by the Felicians as Presentation College, which was another. And Bozena Buda had asked about the 4-year college. That was actually another institution that was then founded by essentially supported entirely by Polish Americans. But it was in the many thousands, and it was a really, really significant number. And the education and the service that they provided over those decades was tremendous, and it's underappreciated because people sort of, the sisters were always there; they were kind of in the background. But when those orders started to decline, it was a huge blow because a lot of that was really, at the time, keep in mind that the Polish community was in very difficult financial straits throughout the early 20th century. Poles were at or near the bottom of the pecking order in America. And they had many, many social problems, and the Felicians were right there in the thick of it, addressing all of those and the other women's religious orders. And they created hospitals in addition to schools. They had orphanages. They had, old age homes. They had, a whole range of institutional completeness. And that's one of the things that sort of we forget, I think, if we look at the history of Polish Americans, is how many different institutions there were, how many types of businesses. It was really a fully functioning system, if you will, both on the educational level, but even sort of more broadly.
Thank you.
So if I may follow up, John, on something. This is Bożena again. May I follow up on something?
Absolutely.
About Felician sisters. So I know that, that the Felician sisters were very active in Buffalo, New York, both at the elementary school level, but there was also a Villa Maria Academy and a Villa Maria College.
Yes.
But are those treated as Polish American schools or not? Because
yes.
I don't know if they taught. I'll listen to your answer. Thank you.
Those were, a lot of those were primarily, in the statistics I cited at the beginning, those are cited as, they're both nursing and teacher training colleges. And that snapshot comes from the early 40s. A number of those later developed into full-fledged 4-year colleges, and Villa Maria is a good example. Buffalo was one of the major centers for Buffalo, Livonia, and Chicago were the 3 major centers for the Felicians. They did not form, as far as I can recall, a college in Chicago. They did have a pretty significant hospital there, but they did here in Michigan, and then also in Buffalo. So a number of those institutions that I mentioned evolved into sort of more full-fledged junior or even 4-year colleges. But in the 40s, sort of finding a snapshot of that system. So yeah, there were a number of others, and there were other seminaries as well. There was a St. John Cantius Seminary in Erie, Pennsylvania. Was another one that was formed a bit later, didn't last as long as St. Cyril and Methodius, and there was also one in Massachusetts, St. Hyacinth Seminary, which is, I believe, as I recall, was a junior seminary. So there were these institutions continue to flourish, and in some cases are have essentially become 4-year liberal arts colleges, or their career ed. For example, the Felician College here in Madonna is known for training nurses. There's a hospital on the same campus. They train nurses. So it's a very well-regarded program. And of course, that's a, in terms of vocational education today, that's a very important, program to have. So that's certainly very viable. And a number of those exist. Obviously, the students entering them were once, all largely Polish. Now, not the case. Now there, relatively few are, but that's a sort of changing demographic.
I'm curious, Dr. Radziłowski, if during this time, I mean, we're in you mentioned that, the 1880s. I'm curious because it seems like the Felician sisters, I mean, they were encouraged to step out of the home and into these public roles. Can you speak on, were they kind of also, what was going on in the country at the time in terms of women's rights? Did they also participate in those movements, or did they stay within their own community?
In terms of like women's voting, I'm not, I mean, there were Polish organizations like the Polish Women's Alliance, for example, that played a major role and was very active in trying to secure voting rights and rights for women in general, which began in the 1890s as a fraternal and was operating. It merged with another fraternal several years ago, but it was still a very large like PNA or PRCUA. But it's a great question, and one of the things you point out is that for your options for a working class immigrant in the 1880s or 1890s or even 1920s was very, very limited. Your education, for most families, education needed to end in the 6th grade, not because they didn't like education, but because the family was in desperate straits and needed people to work. And so boys usually left school in the 6th grade, went to work in a factory. Girls might continue a couple years longer, but then they would go to work. And your roles were, you start a family, you go to work, you start a family. And as we look at these Polish American women's orders, what we see is an alternative to that. Here's a way to serve your community, to be respected, to get education that you would not normally get, and not take that role, that traditional path, if you will, which of course most women did, and we're a product of that. So we should thank our mothers and grandmothers that had us. But for those women, and that's why it was such an important thing for the Polish community, because those were the foot soldiers that educated, cared for everyone at a time when there was no social services, there was nothing, and those women stepped up and did it for very little pay, for the love of God and for the love of neighbor. And it's really a story and they were, like I said, very highly educated. They were intensively patriotic. They wrote textbooks. They had teacher training manuals. They ran hospitals. My great aunt in the 50s started a hospital here in the Detroit area at a time when women never ran hospitals. I mean, the only hospitals in America that were run by women were run by religious sisters. And they were not, if you ever met any of those old sisters, they were not pushovers, they were tough ladies, and they had to be. And that was true in the schools. And there's a lot of the nuns, they were so mean to us. Well, a lot of those, you have to remember, these were inner city schools. We think of Polish Americans, they never broke the law. There were tons of Polish gangs, and there was drugs and alcohol and violence. I mean, these were true inner city neighborhoods. And there were serious problems, and those sisters were right there in the trenches. So they were really the front line, if you will. And the fact that, we've forgotten that there were like over 200 Polish street gangs in Chicago at one point. And the fact that we've forgotten all that is a tribute to how far we've come in America. And a lot of that progress was really due to this educational system and to primarily the women religious who ran it. And that's sort of maybe a long answer. And there's a lot more that could be said about that. There's a really, if you're interested, Lauren, I'll send you, there's a Central Connecticut has it on their the Polish Studies program. There's a link on their website. To an essay that my father wrote called Immigrant Women and Their Daughters on Polish American Women. And it kind of goes through this much more eloquently than I can. And I'll be happy to send you a link, because it is a really interesting topic. And you know, that's just scratching the surface of it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And really, like you said, Father Dąbrowski, I mean, he is really interesting. I mean, he was progressive in terms, you know, of, you mentioned when he did the integrated curriculum, there was even handiwork for the girls. So I love that. That's so interesting that in that time he was already, you know, looking ahead.
And the accounts, when you read some of these accounts, you know, and I've taught, you know, in many classrooms, many different situations, and probably quite a few you have, you know, just that image of him, you know, crawling around in the garden, you know, showing his students the leaves and pointing out, or, you know, I mean, he would be such a, you know, so that's why I said if there were, you know, if you were, you know, having a dinner party and you wanted to invite the most interesting people from history, I think he would be one of them, because he lived so many different lives, and he must have been such an inspiring teacher. And the Felicians today look to him as in a sense, their spiritual father here in America. He was the one that brought them. He was the one that sort of gave them their start here in America. And incidentally, just to go back to the question that Mark had, a lot of these orders, at least the ones that the Polish ones, the Felicians are a good example, but the Sisters of Nazareth is another. They started in Europe, but they're large. Very quickly, within a decade, they had more sisters in America than they had in Europe, and more provinces. Very, very quickly. So they really became Polish American orders. And there were a number of other orders that developed, like Sisters of St. Joseph, for example, developed, even though they're not a Polish order, they developed specific entire provinces that were like 100%, or almost 100% Polish. Like it was one in Sylvania, Ohio, for example.
John, just a little bit of a different question. Do you have a sense of the architectural legacy of you know, how many schools still survive as schools, or how, because I'm thinking of Victor Cordella, the architect in Minnesota.
Right.
He did half a dozen schools, but only one or two of them have survived, even as, you know.
Yeah, the schools were more likely to be torn down and repurposed, you know, and that's certainly the case, obviously, in Detroit, where a number of them, you know, the parishes are still going, but the church, the schools became, you know, were either torn down. Some of them became charter schools, or other, you know, similar institutions, or were given over to some other use. And a lot less attention was paid to the architecture. So I don't know how many. I mean, a great survey. We need you know, the Polish Bill Gates to fund some of us to do that study, because, you know, I mean, there were over 600 parochial schools at one point, and in fact in Minneapolis, in Northeast Minneapolis, not only is there Holy Cross, but there was actually a PNCC school in Minneapolis, which is really rare, and the building is still there. I think it's like apartments now or something, but that's also a really rare survival, and there's not many examples that I've seen of those schools surviving either. So it would be great to do a survey of that and sort of try to find out more about the architecture. But yeah, it was as far as, you know, as far as our own campus goes, you know, we know the architects that built them. The architects that designed them were mostly Polish or Polish American. There was a man named Radziłowski who did a number of the buildings on our campus, who was a Detroit area architect. So we do know a little bit about that, but again, the church architecture celebrated it, justly so, but the other sort of more mundane architecture is probably forgotten. And the same would be true of the the convents and the rectories that were built alongside of these. They were usually, those were the first buildings to go, you know, if the parish began to lose numbers.
I believe we have time maybe for one more. Does anyone have any other questions or comments? You scroll through here. No? Okay. In that case, I would like to thank Dr. Radziłowski and everyone for joining. And I would like to give the floor to our Executive Director, Alice Poor, for closing comments and prayers.
Well, first of all, Dr. Radziłowski, thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. My favorite part was the contribution of the Felician sisters. I mean, the story is so interesting. I want to take some time and read more about them and their contribution. Moving forward, I thought it was brilliant that they wanted to get this education going with the young communities. And so they adapted a curriculum already established, modified it for themselves, and moved on. I think that's brilliant. If anybody's ever written curriculum, it's tedious, and they didn't waste time getting started. And I love that story. So thank you so much for that. And Bishop's wish was, as we have an event, we also end it with a prayer. So if you don't mind bowing your heads. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, amen.
Amen.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for an evening of fellowship. Lord, we thank you for the blessing of Bishop Yonta and his vision of this beautiful heritage center, which continues to educate others of the history and the traditions of the Polish people. Father, we thank you for Dr. Radziłowski, for his dedication to his research and allowing him to share these stories of the contributions of Father Leopold Moczygemba and Father Joseph Zabrowski and the Felician sisters, so that we are reminded of the impact that they had on the Polish community and their push for a quality education for all Polish immigrants. We thank you for all of our blessings, Lord. In your name we pray. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen.